Wyoming Territory, September 1876. The Coyotes were closing in. Shiloh Landry dropped to her knees beside the dying fire, clutching the long stick she had used to stir the coals. The wind rushed cold across the dry plains, whispering through the cottonwoods that lined the creek. The sun had long since sunk behind the hills, leaving only a pale wash of orange on the horizon. Around her, yellow eyes blinked from the brush. Her heart thundered in her chest. She had been walking for 2 days. Her boots were blistered, her dress torn at the hem, her canteen empty. The wagon, her father's last desperate venture west, had broken an axle on the far trail. He had died that morning, fevered and gasping, clinging to the photograph of her mother. She buried him beneath a cairn of river stones. There had been no other choice. Now, the coyotes had caught her scent. She swung the stick when the first one came close, its shoulders hunched and lips pulled back. It yelped and darted away, but the others were patient. They circled. They watched. Shiloh's breath came faster. "Please," she whispered. "God, not like this." A low growl from the left made her turn sharply. Too many. She could not fight them all. Her fingers trembled around the stick, and then from the dark hills came the sound of hooves. He rode in silent, a tall figure on a bay horse, rifle resting steady in his hands. He did not shout or raise alarm. He just moved silent as the dusk, sure as winter. The horse's hooves crunched dry sage as he came down the ridge, and the coyotes turned, uneasy. One barked. Another growled low. The cowboy lifted the rifle and fired once. A clean crack split the stillness. A coyote yelped and fled. The others scattered, tails tucked. Shiloh froze, her eyes wide. The man rode closer. His hat shadowed his face, but the firelight caught his jaw, dark stubble, tight-set mouth, eyes sharp as flint. He dismounted slow, careful, and stepped between her and the wild. "You all right, miss?" His voice was quiet, but it carried something solid, something that held. She tried to answer and found her throat dry. She nodded. He knelt, checked the fire, then looked her over. "You hurt?" "No," she said hoarsely. He studied her a moment longer, then offered his canteen. Shiloh drank, coughing once, then looked up at him. "Thank you." He nodded once, then walked back to his horse and pulled a can of beans from the saddlebag. He set it near the fire, opened it with his knife, and handed her half. She took it. "What's your name?" "Zeke Whitlow." She stared at him, the name settling into her like the warmth of beans in her belly. "Shiloh Landry." He did not say much more, just tended the fire, checked that the coyotes were gone, and sat close but not too close. She watched his hands, rough, steady, scarred. A man who had seen too much, maybe, but still stood upright. When the food was gone, he laid out his bedroll and gestured to it. "You take this. I will sit up." She hesitated. "I can manage." "You already did," he said calmly. "Now let someone else try." For the first time in days, she did not argue. In the morning, the sky was wide and soft with early light. Zeke had not slept. He stood facing east, his rifle slung across his back, his horse saddled and ready. Shiloh rose, brushing dirt from her skirts. "Where are you headed?" "Sheridan," he replied. "North of here, you?" She hesitated. "I do not know." Zeke looked at her, really looked. "No family. My father died 2 days ago. It was just us." He nodded, slow. "You have anyone waiting?" "No." He paused. "You can ride with me to Sheridan." "Folks there. Safer roads." She studied him. He did not offer pity, just a place on the trail. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." He helped her onto his horse, then climbed up behind, his arms strong around the reins, his body warm at her back. They rode into the morning, the prairie stretching wide before them. They did not speak much that first day. But when she looked back at the place where she had nearly died, she felt something shift. Not fear, not sorrow, something like safety. And beside her, Zeke rode steady as steel. By the time they reached the cottonwood grove near the river's bend, the sun hung low behind them, coating the land in amber light. Zeke drew the horse to a halt beside a shallow draw, dismounted, then offered his hand to help Shiloh down. She took it without hesitation, her fingers cold despite the long ride. Her legs wobbled when her boots touched the ground. "We'll make camp here," he said, leading the horse toward a patch of level ground near the water. He began unsaddling without waiting for reply. She followed, her eyes scanning the trees. "You know this place," he gave a short nod. "Passed through here once. Good cover. Clean water." Shiloh knelt by the creek, scooping a handful to her lips. The cold bit into her palms, but it felt clean, tasted like sky. When she sat back on her heels, she found Zeke watching her. "That coat's too thin," he said, turning to rummage through the saddle roll. He pulled out a wool blanket and handed it to her. She wrapped it around her shoulders. "You always carry extra," he crouched to gather dry branches. "Never know who you'll find on the road." She watched him work, his movements exact and practiced. He built the fire low and wide, keeping the flames tucked beneath a ring of stones. It was a fire made by someone used to being watched. "You were a soldier," she said. He didn't answer right away. Just fed another branch to the kindling. "I was. Blue or gray?" "Blue," he said, voice steady. "8th Kansas, infantry." She drew the blanket closer, not from cold but from the weight of his words. "You see much of it." He met her eyes, and for a long moment she saw something behind them, something worn down but not gone. Enough to remember. She didn't ask more. The fire caught and the light danced over his face, softening the tired lines near his eyes. "I've never been this far north," she said, shifting the subject. "My father thought there'd be work closer to the rail lines." He nodded toward the horizon. "Sheridan's got some sawmills and a freight yard. It's hard living, but a man can earn." She looked down at her hands. Dirt lined her knuckles, the skin chapped raw. "And a woman," Zeke sat back on his heels. "Some cook for the crews, some take in boarders. There's a schoolhouse too. Might be they need someone decent." "I can read and write," she said. "Figures and letters, both. My mother taught me before she passed." His eyes flicked toward her. "Then you'll have more than most." The firelight caught a strand of her hair where it had slipped free, casting a copper glow. She tucked it behind her ear, suddenly aware of the quiet between them. "Why were you riding alone?" she asked. He leaned back against his saddlebag. "Land deal went sour near Rawlins. Man I trusted turned out to have a fast mouth and nothing behind it." Shiloh studied him. "You lose everything, just the part I hadn't already let go." The wind shifted, rustling the leaves above them. Somewhere farther down the creek a night bird called once, then fell silent. "I never learned to shoot," she said, her voice low. Zeke didn't look surprised. "Would you want to?" "I don't want to be scared again." He nodded once. "Then we'll start tomorrow." She looked at him, the sure line of his jaw, the way he spoke plain and never too much. There was no gentleness in him for its own sake, but something steadier, like the way the earth holds after rain. "I never thanked you," she said. He turned to her then, quiet and still. "You don't owe me thanks." She looked toward the fire, the warmth sinking into her bones. "Even so." That night he slept near the horse, rifle close back to the fire. She lay wrapped in the blanket he'd given her, the stars above cut sharp against the dark. For the first time in days, her mind did not run ahead of her. She watched the leaves shift overhead and listened to the steady sound of his breathing beyond the flame. It was not comfort, not yet. But it was something like a beginning. By mid-morning, the frost had loosened its grip on the grass, and the creek ran clearer than it had the night before. Shiloh stood near the edge of the trees, sleeves rolled to her elbows, holding the small revolver Zeke had drawn from his saddlebag and handed to her without ceremony. The metal felt too light for its purpose. the grip worn smooth, like it had passed through many hands before hers. "Keep your arms steady," Zeke said from a few paces back, "and don't curl your thumb over." She adjusted her stance the way he'd shown her, feet apart, back straight. Her heart thudded, but not from fear. She pulled the trigger. The shot cracked out, sharp and sudden, and the tin can atop a split log jerked sideways but didn't fall. "Better," he said, walking forward to reset the target. "You pulled left. Try again." She exhaled slow, lined up the sight again. This time the can tumbled to the dirt. He gave a short nod. "That's the one." The sun edged higher, burning off the last of the moisture from the scrub. Her ears still rang faintly when she turned toward him, lowering the gun. "You make a habit of teaching strangers to shoot." Zeke knelt beside the log, brushing grit from the can. "Only when it seems they'll use it right." "Wouldn't take much for someone to use it wrong," she said, watching his hands. He stood and met her gaze. "That's true of most things." They packed the camp without hurry. She bundled the blanket, tied it to the saddle. He checked the horse's hooves one by one, running his hand down its legs with the kind of care she hadn't expected from a man who seemed carved from the same stone as the land. As they mounted up and started north again, the trail narrowed between two ridges, pushing them closer together in the saddle. The silence between them wasn't heavy, it lived, breathed, settled like dust on dry grass. She found herself leaning into the rhythm of the horse's gait, the sway of his body behind her, steady and sure. After some time, she spoke without turning. "You ever think about giving it all up?" He didn't answer right away. The horse picked its way over a patch of loose rock before he replied. "Did once. Bought a small place west of Abilene. Thought I'd dig a well, raise some hogs, maybe build a porch. What happened? Neighbor's son got caught up with a gang. Came through one night, shot the horse, took the rifle, burned the shed. They rode on a while before she said, 'You could have stayed, rebuilt.'" His voice was low. "Didn't want to be the kind of man who has to sleep with his rifle beside the door." She let the words settle. They rode past a line of wind-warped pines, the scent of sap and dry needles thick in the air. "Did you leave anyone behind?" she asked. "No," he said. "Just left what didn't hold." They crested a ridge by late afternoon. Below, the road narrowed through a shallow valley of goldgrass and broken fence posts. A cart sat abandoned near a fallen cottonwood, one wheel sunk deep into the mud. A pair of crows perched on the yoke, silent and still. Zeke slowed the horse. "Stay close," he said, easing the rifle loose from the saddle holster. She felt her breath catch but did as he said. They passed the cart slow. No bodies, no tracks. The wood showed signs of weather, not struggle. She glanced back once as they left it behind, the crows lifting into the sky without a sound. They stopped at a spring-fed pool near the valley's bottom to water the horse. While Zeke checked the leather cinch, she stepped away to wash her hands and face. The water was cold, but it cleared the dust from her skin, and for the first time since her father's burial she didn't feel hollow. When she stood and turned, Zeke was watching her, not guarded, not uncertain, just watching. "What is it?" she asked. He shook his head once. "You carry sorrow different than most." She didn't look away. "I don't know any other way to carry it." He stepped forward, slower than before, and handed her a strip of dried meat. She took it, their fingers brushing briefly. "You hold quiet like it's armor," he said. "So do you," she replied. Neither of them smiled. But something passed between them then, not warmth exactly, but the slow recognition of something honest. They sat beside the pool, eating in silence, the horse grazing nearby. Evening would come soon. The wind had calmed, and the sky above the ridge turned the soft blue of late day. They would camp again before dark, and tomorrow the road would stretch farther north. But for now, she sat beside him. the ache in her chest dulled by the nearness of another soul who didn't ask for anything and didn't offer more than he could carry. And in that, she found a kind of peace she hadn't thought possible. They reached the outskirts of Sheridan 2 days later, just as the sky turned the color of pewter and the wind shifted, thick with the promise of snow. The town rose out of the earth without fanfare, low wood buildings, smoke curling from chimneys, and the sound of saws and hammers drifting through the cold air like distant music. A freight wagon creaked past them along the muddy road, pulled by oxen that looked half-starved, their ribs sharp beneath patchy hides. Zeke slowed the horse and nodded toward a narrow alley between a blacksmith shop and a boarding house. "Stable's back that way." "I'll put him up." Shiloh stepped down, boots crunching over frost-hardened mud. Her legs ached from the ride, but she felt steadier than she had the week before. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and kept her eyes low as they passed men unloading crates and women sweeping porches. Nobody looked twice at her, which was a comfort she hadn't expected. Zeke led the horse through the alley and disappeared behind the stable doors. She stayed near the wall, watching a group of boys chase each other across the street, their laughter rising above the wind. One of them wore boots too large for his feet and a hat that slid down over his eyes, but he didn't seem to mind. For a moment, she imagined what it might have been like to grow up in a place like this, where the worst danger was a splinter or a scraped knee. Zeke returned a few minutes later, brushing straw from his coat. "There's a woman who lets out rooms," he said. "Widow named Mrs. Caffrey. She don't ask too many questions." Shiloh followed him up the boardwalk to a narrow house with peeling shutters and a porch that listed slightly to one side. He knocked twice. The door opened on a round-shouldered woman with gray hair pinned in a twist and a face lined more from squinting into wind than from age. Zeke tipped his hat. "Ma'am." Mrs. Caffrey looked them over, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "You come quiet, you stay clean, and you pay by the week. $2, meals not included," Zeke nodded. "She'll take the room, I'll cover the first week." Shiloh started to protest, but he glanced at her and she fell silent. Inside, the air smelled of boiled potatoes and wood smoke. "Mrs. Caffrey led her up a narrow stair and opened a door at the end of the hall. The room held a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a window that let in just enough light to see the dust motes dancing in the air. Zeke didn't step inside. He stayed at the threshold, hands in his coat pockets. "I'll be in town a few days," he said. "Need to see a man about some land east of here. You'll be safe." She looked around the small room, then back at him. "What if I want to do more than stay safe?" His eyes didn't shift. "Then you tell me what you need." She watched his shoulders, the way he leaned slightly to one side like the wind had shaped him. "I want work," she said. "Something that earns. There's a church school 2 blocks down. They lost their teacher at the end of summer. Might be they're still looking." She nodded, then stepped forward, hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "Why are you helping me?" Zeke's jaw shifted, but only slightly. "Because when I saw you out there by that fire, I knew you weren't done yet." The silence between them stretched, but neither turned away. "I won't forget that," she said. He gave a short nod, then stepped back and tipped his hat. "I'll stop by in a day or two." After he left, Shiloh washed the trail dust from her face and hands. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the muffled sounds of the street below, boots on wooden planks, a dog barking once, laughter from somewhere near the saloon. The window glass rattled faintly in its frame. That night she lay beneath the quilt, staring at the ceiling beams. The ache in her chest had dulled, replaced by something quieter. Not hope exactly, but the shape of it, like a seed that had taken hold without her noticing. She didn't know what Zeke would find out there on the edge of the territory or how long he'd stay. But she knew this. When he looked at her, he saw more than what had been lost. He saw what could still be built, and for the first time in a long while she wanted to build something too. The schoolhouse stood plain and square near the edge of town, its clapboard siding sun bleached and patched where knots had pushed through. Inside, the air held the faint scent of chalk and stove ash. A row of desks lined the room, most with initials carved into the wood by restless hands. Shiloh stood at the front, smoothing the apron over her skirt. Reverend Halbrook had given her the key and little else a brief nod, a mention of the last teacher heading east for family, and an assurance that if she kept order and met lessons with discipline, the board would see no reason to interfere. She had thanked him, but her hands had trembled when he left. The first morning, she stood before a half-dozen children ranging from 6 to 12, their eyes wary, their faces wind-chapped and solemn. She introduced herself, gave them their slates, and wrote the day's lessons with careful chalk strokes. Midday, she ladled soup from the pot she'd brought from Mrs. Caffrey's stove and handed out rough bread with a steady hand. No one thanked her. They ate in silence. She didn't mind. She knew what silence meant. That evening, as the sky deepened to bruise, she walked back through town, her boots pinching at the heel. When she reached the porch of the boarding house, Zeke was there, seated on the top step with a tin cup in one hand and a rolled paper in the other. He stood when he saw her, setting the paper aside. "You held the day." "I did," she said, settling beside him. "Barely. One boy threw a slate at the stove because I told him he'd miscounted his sums. Did it break? No, just cracked the corner. I told him next time he'd be splitting kindling with his bare hands." Zeke gave a low breath through his nose, not quite a laugh. "Fair." She glanced at the paper. "News from the land office," he passed it to her. "Claim east of Goose Creek, 40 acres. Water rights. Not much, but enough if you know how to work it." "Do you?" "I've done with less. Soil's thin, but it'll take root crops, and the cabin's standing." She handed the paper back but didn't speak right away. The wind tugged at her sleeve. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about what comes after." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I've been riding too long, Shiloh, not because I was looking for something. I gave that up. But the last few days, I've started wondering if all that riding was just to get me here." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I never expected to stop, not really, just thought I'd keep going until I wore out." "You haven't," he said. "Not even close." Her eyes softened, and she reached for the edge of his coat. "I still wake in the dark, feeling like I'm halfway between where I was and where I'm meant to be." Zeke took her hand in both of his, rough palms gentle around her fingers. "Then come the rest of the way." They married in Reverend Halbrook's parlor the following week, with Mrs. Caffrey and 2 of the schoolchildren watching in stiff Sunday best. Zeke wore his only clean shirt and a coat brushed free of trail dust. Shiloh wore a borrowed dress the color of faded cornflour and a ribbon pinned at her collar that had once belonged to her mother. There was no feast, no music, only a wooden cross, a few quiet words, and the feel of Zeke's hand steady in hers. They moved to the cabin 2 days later, cart piled high with books, tools, and a small iron stove Zeke bartered from a blacksmith in exchange for 2 days' labor and a promise of turnips come fall. The land stretched wide and uneven around them, broken by cottonwoods and a shallow creek that skirted the fence line. Shiloh planted early peas and onions the first week, her fingers raw from the cold earth. Zeke patched the roof with pine shakes and reinforced the door with iron hinges. At night, they sat by the fire, her head against his shoulder. The silence between them no longer hollow but full of breath and heartbeat and the slow rhythm of belonging. One morning in late spring, she found him kneeling by the edge of the garden, his hands dark with soil, coaxing a tender sprout upright with 2 fingers. She crouched beside him, pressing her palm against the back of his. "You mind having a teacher for a wife?" He glanced at her sidelong. "Only if she minds having a man who can't read worth a damn." She leaned into him, her smile quiet. "We'll fix that." Years passed with the seasons, marked by harvests, snowfall, and the soft creak of the porch swing at dusk. The school grew, and the board built a second room. Zeke built a smokehouse and traded potatoes for chickens. The land didn't give easily, but it gave enough. Each day began with shared labor and ended with the slow folding of twilight across the fields. They held hands not out of habit, but because it reminded them of the firelight, the coyotes, the road that had brought them here. And on nights when the wind turned bitter and the lantern flickered low, Shiloh would rest her head against his chest and listen to the steady beat beneath his ribs, the sound that had once pulled her from the edge and now carried her home. They lived long, and they lived well. Together.